Talking about this letter, which is based on the idea of God, who's the Father of mercies, the God of all comforts. And as I mentioned, Paul is defending himself as an apostle. I want to jump ahead, though. I mentioned this idea of defending himself as an apostle. Somebody look ahead, if you would, in chapter 12 and verse 19. What does Paul say there in chapter 12 and verse 19? This is kind of the end of the section we're in right now. Somebody doesn't mind just reading that. Go ahead, Charlie.
Chapter 12, verse 19. Think no along that we yourself. No, in the sight of God, we are speaking in Christ, and everything, dear friends, is for building you up.
Yeah, so I've been saying this idea that he's defending himself, and he even admits, he said, that's sure what it sounds like. That's probably what you've been thinking all along. But he's telling them, said, no, this is actually something more important. And so keep that in mind when I'm using this phrase saying Paul is defending himself. He's not defending Paul. Instead, he's defending Christ because he is an ambassador. He is an apostle of Jesus Christ. So that's one of those things, kind of keep in the back of your mind as you're reading these things. And there's a lot of what we're going to be looking at, especially in our class tonight, where we have to look deeper than the surface. I kind of gave you a teaser of what we're going to be covering tonight at the very end of the last class. When we look in verses 16 through 18, this is kind of foundational to understand everything else Paul is going to say, is what he says in the introduction of it. He says, I don't want anybody to think me foolish, but if so, receive me even as foolish, that I may boast a little. So, okay, Paul, which is it? Are you foolish? Are you not foolish? Should we regard you as foolish? Should we not regard you as foolish? Well, what he's explaining is, he says, I'm going to do some foolishness, but that doesn't mean I am foolish. And we're going to see why he has to do that foolishness. He says it in verse 17, that which I'm speaking, I am not speaking as the Lord would. Well, we know that passage over in Peter, where Peter says, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. And Paul seems to be contradicting that. He says, I'm not speaking as the Lord would speak here. I put three things up here. We could probably come up with more. We just don't have time to get too far into this. But do you see a commonality between King Saul, the first king of Israel? Balaam, remember, he was the man that Balak, the king of Moab, sent him money and said, I want you to come curse these people. And Balaam said, I can only do what the Lord said. He asked the Lord said no. He sent them back and said, tell him I won't come. And then Balak sent greater messengers and more money and said, please come and curse these people. What did Balaam do? Well, he asked the Lord again. And what did the Lord say? Go ahead. The Lord said, go ahead. People of Israel came to the land of Canaan the first time. They sent the spies out. Spies come back with a bad report. What do the people do? You've been covering this, David, or about to cover this. Yeah, they're going to kill Moses and Aaron and say, we're going to appoint new leaders. We're going back to Egypt. That's when God tells the people through Moses, this is what I'm going to do to you. So what do they do next? Okay, that's what the Lord wants. We're going in. Now, what I want you to see with all three of these, and again, we can look at many other examples. God ultimately lets people do what they want to do. To what purpose? Why did God give them king? Remember, God's the one who chose King Saul. It wasn't the people, it was God. Why did God tell Balaam, go ahead? What was God's purpose in doing that? Mhm. Exactly. I think that is kind of the foundation to this, is understanding that God gave us free will and allows us to exercise that free will. But I think it's even, maybe we could take that another step further. Why did God tell Balaam, go ahead? When in fact, what was God going to do to Balaam? Yeah, he was going to, in fact, if you remember, there's a point where Balaam finally sees there is an angel with a sword that was going to kill him. That angel was sent by God. And it was only a donkey that saved his life. So why did God tell him to go ahead when God said, I'm going to kill you if you do? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what. Exactly. He's going to let them do what they want to do to show them that's the wrong path. That's a failure. And that is what I think Paul is doing when he says, I'm not going to speak as the Lord would have me speak. So how is he going to speak? He's speaking the way they're speaking, exactly. And he's going to show them, if I talk the way you guys talk, or if I talk the way you think, I want you to see the failure in that. That's the foolishness. When he says, I want you to allow me to be foolish, he's essentially saying, without being just really rude about it, I want to be like you for a little bit. Or maybe a better way of saying it, I want to be like my opponents are among you. So what Paul is going to do in this section, this is why I'm really thrilled in studying this, is he's going to take what seems to be important to them and to show them the failure. And then he's going to bring them back to God's way. And ultimately, that's what we find in all of these, is God said, okay, I'm going to give you the king you want. Then what came? A king after his own heart. What happened when Balaam actually did go? He spoke what God wanted him to speak, and he blessed the people of Israel. Made King of Moab pretty mad, but he blessed the people of Israel. And 40 years later, those children of the people who said, our children are going to die, their children are the ones who actually entered the land and possessed it as God had promised. So what God shows is, all right, you want to be foolish, I'm going to show you what happens when you're foolish. So keep all of that in mind as we go through what we're studying today. Now, we get down to verse 19. I love the wordplay here. I wish we, in one sense, we all spoke native Koine Greek, so that the wordplay would mean a lot to us. What Paul says here in verse 19, if we would translate it, transliterate it literally, Paul says, you being wise, gladly bear with those who are not wise. And the idea Paul is saying, you think of yourself as being so wise, and yet you're listening to people who have no wisdom. It's doubly ironic, because if they are wise, they wouldn't be listening to people who have no wisdom. And the fact that they are listening to people who have no wisdom is proving they're not wise themselves. But that's what they have been doing with these opponents that are digging their way into that congregation in Corinth. Now, again, It's not the entire church has suddenly just fallen off the rails, but there is a significant enough group of people there that are listening to this and being guided by this. And the message of Paul is being pushed to the side. The message of Jesus Christ is being pushed to the side. And so that's why Paul is not going to give up this battle. We talked about that last week. This is a fight for life and death. And so, yeah, he's being sarcastic here. But he's doing it to get their attention. Again, I get behind where I'm at. And I notice what he says about verse 20. This is the way those opponents had been treating the Corinthians. You bear with anyone if he enslaves you, if he devours you, if he takes advantage of you, if he exalts himself, if he hits you in the face. This is the result. I mean, you look at the book of Galatians, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit and the deeds of the flesh. You just look and see what's the result. And this is the result, the treatment that they're getting from these opponents. It's very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this. The term enslaved there means to lose their autonomy. They lost the ability. I mean, Charlie talked about free will. They were losing their free will because these opponents were forcing them to do things their way. He talks about the fact they're being devoured. That literally is a verb that's used to describe bird or animals of prey eating their what they've destroyed. And Paul says, you're being devoured by these animals of prey. To take from or steal from, literally the idea of being caught by a bait. Something that's you don't recognize that it's actually dangerous. And that's what Paul is saying about them. Exalt themselves, they're lifting themselves up. How many times have we seen Paul emphasize, it's not me, it's the Lord? But these opponents, all they do is say, it's me. And then finally, this one. They strike you on the cheek or hit you in the face. Does that sound familiar? Someone strikes you on the cheek? Yeah, Jesus said the same thing, didn't he? It's kind of fascinating to me. There's a number of occasions, just in what we're going to study today, where Paul and Jesus sound just alike. I guess they really should, shouldn't they? If he's speaking as the Lord, he should sound like the Lord. The term here, the idea of being hitting in the face, these opponents weren't literally going in and beating people up. This is obviously metaphorical. I think Matthew 5 is the same thing. But what it is the fact that they're just being abused. They're receiving abusive treatment, and yet they're accepting that. And Paul says, why? He's asking, why are you glorying in this? Why are you tolerating this? Now, verse 21, in shame, I say, we have become weak. The translators add the phrase there, by comparison. I think that is accurate in the context, although it's not found in the words. But Paul is just simply saying, here's the treatment you've gotten from them. In shame, we've been weak. But it very much is a comparison. But again, comparisons, they're foolish. He talked about that back in chapter 10. He said, those who compare themselves by themselves are what? Without understanding, without wisdom. So he says, bear with me in a little bit of foolishness. I have to use the language that you're seem to be enamored with at this point. And so then starting in verse 22, we find a series of contrasts, comparisons. Here's that foolishness. He's already said people who compare themselves against themselves are without understanding. But now he says, let's look at the comparison. Are they Hebrews? I am. Are they Israelites? I am. Are they children of Abraham? I am. Are they servants of Christ? And the rest of what he's going to talk about for the next 8 to 10 verses is all asking this question, are they servants of Christ? Every measure that you could use, who is a greater servant of Christ? Now, again, this is foolishness. I'm not asking this the way the Lord would ask. What did Jesus say is the greatest among you? The least, the one who serves. But Paul is speaking foolishly now. The way they look at things, who is the greatest? Well, I'm not going to get on all these details, but he says, I've been in far more labors, far more imprisonments, often in danger of death, beaten times without number. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes, and on and on and on and on. Could any of them match Paul in the things that they consider to be valuable? No. They couldn't match him. Now, I mentioned last week, and this is important for us to remember. If we look at this list of things and we say, wow, I am so impressed by all the things that the Apostle Paul did in service to God, there's just no greater apostle than that. There's no greater Christian than that. We're failing. That's not what Paul wants us to see. Paul is instead saying, those of you who think all these things that matter, okay, here, match mine up against theirs. But he's telling them, don't do that. Don't match those things up. That's foolishness. That's not the way the Lord wants us to think or talk. He's only doing that, if you go back to chapter 11, verse 12, to cut off opportunity. Remember, these opponents were disguising themselves as servants of light. And he says, I am cutting off their opportunity. They were trying to elevate themselves to be equal with Paul in the eyes of the Corinthians. And the Corinthians seemed to be dazzled by those sparkling lights. And so Paul says, all right, let me talk to you on your level to bring you back to God's level, to bring you back to the way Jesus should be. So yes, all of these things were good for God's kingdom. But Paul is not saying a single thing there to say this is good about Paul. And we have to remember that. We have to recognize this within its context. None of this is to say this is good about Paul. Anybody with any thoughts or comments? Go ahead, Dave.
Were enduring these super apostles. The descriptions that Paul gives are so similar to the things that he's suffering at the hands of these unbelievers. And so he's kind of by this contrast, even comparing these people who are taking advantage of them, those who are doing these things with Paul. Yeah,
Very good contrast to see that connection. And again, these are the same things that happened to Jesus at the hands of the Jews. So again, there's so many of those connections when we look at these things in detail. So then we get back to verse 30. And I love what Paul kind of says here. Verse 30 says, if I have to boast, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. That's just not where we start. If you feel like somebody's just kind of pushed you in a corner where you just have to talk about yourself, do you want to start with, here's my weaknesses, here's my failures? That's not where we want to start, is it? We kind of want to start with, well, this is what I can do well. But Paul says, if I have to boast, if you force me to boast, then I'm going to talk about my weaknesses. And that's key to understanding this context that we find here at the end of chapter 11. In contrast to that, he says, the God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows I am not lying. In other words, he's not lying when he boasts about his weaknesses. And then verses 32 and 33. I got to admit, I'd read this many times, really without looking at the context, and kind of wondered, why does Paul tell us this story? It is not found in the book of Acts, so we don't have any kind of a corroborating record of this. So why does Paul tell this story of when he was in Damascus and the king, the governor of Damascus, is trying to kill him, trying to capture him, and he is let down in a basket through the wall? Well, let's put it in that context of verse 30. He's having to boast. So what's his boast? It's his weakness. It's pertaining to his weakness. Paul escaped from a powerful man trying to kill him. How did he escape? Whose power was it that saved him? It wasn't Paul's. It was the disciples holding a rope, letting him down while he's hiding in a basket. In other words, Paul didn't do a thing to save himself there, except maybe be quiet. So he's showing this example of how someone else saved him. But ultimately, of course, who was it that saved him? It was God, exactly. You contrast this with these opponents of Paul, what are they saying about themselves? Well, we saw it back in verse 20. They elevate themselves, they lift themselves up, they exalt themselves. You can see the very clear contrast that Paul is drawing between these opponents that are trying to make themselves equal with Paul and who Paul actually is. That brings us to chapter 12, which is, I think, the center of really understanding what's going on here. In verse 1, he says, boasting is necessary. He's already made it so very clear that that doesn't make it easy or comfortable or desirable. He's only doing it because he has to. He's saying boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. This is not speaking the way the Lord would have him speak. But he says, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. He says that in plural. Plural visions, plural revelations. Yet, most of us know the story. How many visions and revelations is he going to talk about? Just one. Just one revelation that he's going to talk about. Now, it's pretty amazing. We'll get into that in just a moment. So why does he say it in plural? Well, I would suggest to you that what he's talking about is these measurements that the opponents have been holding up, and the Corinthians apparently have been thinking, oh yeah, that's significant, that's important. Obviously, what they've been doing is talking about their visions and revelations. They're talking about the things that they know about the Lord. And so Paul's kind of saying, all right, boasting is necessary. We got to talk about visions and revelations. We'll talk about visions and revelations. And then he starts in verse 2. He says, I know a man. You ever heard somebody say, I know a man? Or generally what we'll hear today is, I'd like to ask a question. I'm just asking for a friend. And of course, wink, wink, we know what that means. They're asking for themselves. When Paul says, I know a man, who's he talking about? Yeah, he's talking about Paul. So why does he start out by saying, I know a man? Well, let me jump ahead. Verse 5. On behalf of such a man will I boast. So I know a man, and I'm going to boast about that man. But what does he say? On my own behalf, I will not boast. So when he's saying, I know a man, what Paul is doing is separating the man that this happened to from Paul the man, from Paul himself. And he's doing that partly because of what we see in verse 7, to keep from exalting himself. The Lord gave him a great lesson, and he's learned that lesson. So he's separating the man that this revelation happened to from Paul. So I know a man 14 years ago. He's very specific in the details about this. Interestingly, as we go back through the book of Acts and also in the book of Galatians, we recognize, and I'm not going to take the time to go through this, but we just recognize looking at the years that are given there, this is a time period that's not covered in the book of Acts. It's a time period when Paul had gone to Arabia, Damascus and Arabia and Tarsus, and we don't know the specifics of what he had done during that time period. And it really isn't until we get to chapter 13 that we come back to Barnabas going to get Paul, and that's when we find active coverage of Paul. But at some time during that period is where Paul is going to see this revelation. And so he's just describing this to them. He says it happened 14 years ago. And 3 times he emphasizes, I don't know whether it was in the body or out of the body. So he's making clear that when this revelation happened, he did not himself know whether it was an out-of-body experience or something that happened within his body. It's very similar to the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. We're told there that the Holy Spirit grabs Ezekiel up by the hair and takes him to Jerusalem. And yet his body remained there at the river Chebar. In fact, the Israelites were actually gathered in front of him, coming to receive a revelation from God or a prophecy from God. And while they're there, God takes Ezekiel to Jerusalem. And we find 4 chapters in the book of Ezekiel covering what he sees in Jerusalem, and then he's brought back. Obviously, that's the prophecy that God wanted to give those people that were gathered there. So Paul emphasizes, 3 times, I don't know whether this is in the body or out of the body. He says, but this man was caught up to the 3rd heaven. What's the 3rd heaven? I'm sorry, say it again. Exactly. Very, very good description. The atmosphere was the 1st heaven, essentially that which surrounds the earth. And then outer space is the 2nd heaven. And the 3rd heaven is beyond the physical creation. This is God's home, God's place. And so Paul is caught up to see this 3rd heaven. We see an example of that in the book of Revelation, where John in Revelation chapter 4 is called up by an angel opening a door and saying, come up here. And John is called up to see things there, which are amazing. My 2 favorite chapters in the Bible is Revelation 4 and 5, because that's the clearest vision we have of what heaven is. And even then it's all symbolic. But Paul says, I was called up to see it. Again, the wordplay is fascinating here. He says, I saw things that man is not permitted to speak. It's very hard to translate into English, but in Greek, it would have just been blazing lights for the Corinthians. You remember I've talked about the idea of rhetoric? That was the wisdom that the Corinthians, especially, who was centered around Corinth, the idea of rhetoric. These were orators who would speak out and impress people just by their public speaking ability. They could put other people down, they could elevate themselves. It wasn't the wisdom of what they said, it was how they said it. We saw how it translated when the people said about Paul that his letters are weighty, his presence is unimpressive. The reason why that's important is that Paul said, I saw things, literally words, events, that man cannot speak. That is literally translated from no rhetoric. So where the opponents of Paul were emphasizing their rhetoric, their words, Paul says, I saw things that can't be put into words. To me, that really emphasizes the contrast between Paul and his opponents. And this should be something the Corinthians could so very clearly see, the difference between them. That's all they do is talk. These opponents, Paul, they're talking. And Paul says, the Lord showed me things that I can't say. I can't talk. There's simply no way to describe. You see, the thing about communication, when I say something, you hear the words I use, and your brain takes those words and interprets those words based on ideas and thoughts that reside in your brain. If there's someone who doesn't speak English, they're going to hear the exact same words and it will mean nothing to them. The only reason it means something to you is because these words all have meaning to you. But if these are things, events, words that have no meaning to any human being, because none of us have an experience of that, that's kind of what Paul is saying. There's just no way to describe in a way that makes sense the things that he saw. And obviously those were impressive things, because that's when Paul then gets into the thorn in the flesh. I like what one writer said. There is nothing in the text that explains to us what that thorn in the flesh is, which hasn't stopped any commentator from writing pages and pages of speculation as to what they think that thorn in the flesh is. I'm not going to try to do that. What we do know is it came from Satan and it was used by God. And that in itself speaks volumes about the entire Bible. From the very beginning, from Genesis chapter 3, God has taken the actions of Satan and he's used them to his glory. And that's what Paul says about this thorn of the flesh. It came from Satan, but God used it to his benefit, used it specifically to Paul's benefit. Keep you from exalting yourself. And what did Paul do? He prayed 3 times. Take this away from me. Does that sound familiar? I've kind of dropped the hint several times through the class.
Right.
Jesus in the garden. Let this cup pass from me. And remember, Jesus first prayed, I know everything is possible with you. Let this cup pass from me. Then he said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Paul prayed fervently 3 times, take this thorn away. And Paul and Jesus got the same answer. My grace will get you through this without taking it away. My grace is sufficient for you. And so Jesus ended what? After the 3rd attempt. What does Paul do? He stops after the 3rd time. Now, that is not a biblical injunction that you can't pray for something more than 3 times. But there is a recognition here that when we pray for something fervently and God doesn't answer our prayer, we need to be willing to accept that. And instead, we need to recognize what is God doing by not responding the way that I would like for him to respond. Because what God is doing is good for me. Even though I'm praying for God to do something else, God is still answering in a way that's good for me. Go ahead, Charlie.
God, everybody, children, they understand that.
Mhm. Yeah, I misspoke when I said not answering. God is not answering the way we want it to be answered. Yeah, that's a very good point to make. God always answers our prayers. In this case, God's response is, my grace is sufficient for you. And wow, what a powerful statement that is. God's grace is sufficient for me for no matter what I'm facing. And he doesn't have to take it away to be sufficient. Okay. Yeah, we just don't have time. Let me stop at that point. But that's what Paul recognizes. I'm going to boast in the Lord. Here he's bringing them back. This is the way you ought to be thinking. This is the way the Lord would have me speak. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.